It was supposed to be a routine press conference until Stephen A. Smith took the microphone and decided to reveal a family secret that even Michael Jordan's closest circle would not accept. But before you find out what that secret is, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so we can discover the world of basketball together. Okay, if you're ready, let's get started. The NBA Players Association's headquarters in New York was unusually crowded that morning. Media members lined up at the entrance, and security had been tripled. According to the press, it was supposed to be a routine press conference about collective bargaining agreements. But everyone who entered the building could already feel the static tension in the air. Stephen A. Smith looked as confident as ever in his gray pinstriped suit. But this time, the stern look in Smith's eyes seemed to indicate something else. The black leather folder he was holding certainly didn't contain just a few documents. In fact, it held the key to a major upheaval. Smith appeared very quiet, but it was obvious that a storm was brewing behind that silence. The hall where the meeting was to take place was packed. Everyone was there, from NBA executives to player representatives, media giants to investors. There was hardly any room to sit. Those who couldn't find a seat leaned against the walls. Representatives from Jordan Enterprises were in the front row. Unfortunately, Michael Jordan was not there. He was not there, but his influence could be felt in every corner of the room. The first speeches were as expected: thanks, plans, and small smiles. Meanwhile, Stephen A. was waiting impatiently for his turn. Even with his quiet demeanor, he had managed to draw attention to himself. People had interrupted him 3 times, but when it happened again, he decided he would not wait any longer. "Smith, are you finished, gentlemen?" he asked without raising his voice, but his eyes were as sharp as a doctor's scalpel. The room suddenly became as still as a living creature waiting for a command. The NBA president tried to wrap things up, but Stephen A. refused to let go of the microphone. "If I'm going to be interrupted like this, I want to use this time wisely," he said. He quickly pulled a document from the folder he had opened. It was a document he had been hinting at for weeks, but no one knew exactly what it was. Some thought he was just chasing ratings. But when he made the revelation, nothing was the same anymore. "Please put this on record." His voice was calm, but his words were as sharp as a surgeon's. He continued, "These documents belong to Yvette Prieto, who, as you know, is Michael Jordan's wife. Yes, the contents of this document show that their marriage contract was quietly redrafted 4 months before the campaign period." Smith's statement hit the room like a building collapsing. Everyone held their breath for a moment. An NBA executive whispered in a voice loud enough to be heard, "I think he must be joking." Others turned their heads and looked at each other, but Stephen A. continued without even blinking. He raised the documents in his hand and said, "And this is a change. It includes a special clause that comes into effect in the event of legal scandals or public damage to reputation." At that very moment, everything felt like a chain had been broken. The room had suddenly turned into a television studio. The cameras were still rolling, but this was no longer an ordinary press conference. It had turned into a live broadcast of an exposé program. Everyone was trying to say something loudly. Some were questioning the validity of the documents. Meanwhile, an official had rushed out of the back of the room with his phone, but Stephen A. hadn't moved an inch. Someone tried to interrupt him again, but he raised his hand and said, "If they expect me to be silenced, they are definitely mistaken. This system, which expects women, families, and the public to remain silent, is unfortunately no longer working, because the truth is always more important than egos." At that moment, #Yvette Clause had already trended on social media. It wasn't just basketball accounts. Some lawyers, fans, and even famous artists were reacting to the statement. Nothing like this had ever happened in NBA history. The president of the hall adjusted the microphone and banged his gavel repeatedly on the table, shouting, "Order! Order!" But order had already been disrupted. Stephen A. quickly gathered his papers and leaned back in his chair. He wasn't smiling or angry. His expression was that of a man who knew exactly what he had done. At that moment, he was making NBA history, but Stephen A. Smith didn't want to turn it into a show. The chaos in the hall, the red lights of the cameras, and the frantically texting phones were all left aside, because at that very moment, He was the person who knew best what he had caused. The impact of those moments on the street was felt within minutes. First, a video exploded on social media. The moment of transformation, which began with the phrase, "Let the record reflect," caught the attention of not only those interested in sports news, but also lawyers, fans, and even the music industry. The hashtag #YvetteClause was shared millions of times in just 1 hour. On TikTok, sports lawyers began analyzing how Stephen A. skillfully used the statements in the documents. NBA pages on Instagram shared screenshots one after another. Threads were started on Reddit. But this wasn't just social media madness. This was a system being shaken to its core. At the Jordan Enterprises headquarters, a crisis code was issued before noon. Messages referred to internally as a red alert were immediately distributed. Secret meetings were called. Those close to Jordan couldn't understand how the documents had been leaked. "This has to be a mistake," said one of his assistants. But no, this was no mistake. It was like a planned mine explosion. Michael Jordan was eating lunch in his private office in Chicago at the time. When his chief advisor entered with a laptop in his hand, his eyes widened. "You need to see this, buddy," he said, and played the video. Stephen A.'s voice echoed throughout the office. "This contract contains a clause that comes into effect in the event of a public scandal." Jordan's eyebrows shot up. He slammed his hand on the table twice. His 2 assistants in the room were immediately ushered out. A third employee said he could hear him shouting from the hallway. "Is he trying to drag my wife into this? Who gave this man these documents?" Outside, the media was still fanning the flames. The press office was scrambling to prepare a temporary statement on Jordan's behalf. But the number of questions they had to answer was growing. Why did you renew Yvette Prieto's contract before the campaign? Does this mean he's afraid for Jordan's future? Is Yvette planning to leave Michael Jordan? The most dangerous question was this a trust issue? A different wind was blowing around the NBA. Some thought Stephen A. had gone too far. Others said that for the first time, someone had broken the silence behind the curtain like a jackhammer. At the same time, Stephen A. had left the building. As he walked out the back door with his 2 assistants, a young media worker caught up with him, out of breath. "Are you okay?" Stephen A. replied without turning his head. "I've never been better," because he knew what he had done, and he knew exactly what was going to happen. It wasn't just a statement. It was the most powerful bomb ever dropped on the corporate silence of NBA history. That same night, Stephen A. posted a single sentence on his social media account. "The truth never asks for permission." Thousands of comments, thousands of reactions. But of course, there were also thousands of messages of support. For the first time in his life, an NBA commentator had taken such a clear shot at the dark corners outside the court and shed light on them. Things were getting even worse for Jordan. For example, no one knew where Yvette Prieto was that day. She had been seen at a charity event just 5 days earlier, but she had not been seen since. Members of the press were now practically stationed outside her home, but Yvette was not talking. There was no statement, no tweet, not even a glance. And silence, sometimes, speaks louder than words. Jordan's inner circle took action to reach out to donors. They tried to reassure major sponsors. But there was only one thing on everyone's mind. If the documents are true, who leaked them? That night, Stephen A. was sitting at home in Washington, D.C. He had ginger tea in front of him. His phone was face down on the table. His assistant Tasha was leaning against the counter, watching him intently. "Buddy, CNN is calling you to go on the air. Are you going?" Stephen A. looked up. "Let them breathe a little. They're already drowning enough," he said. But in the NBA, silences don't last long, especially when someone lights a match, and that match had already been lit. No explanation and no press release could completely extinguish this fire, because people were paying attention not only to what Stephen A. Smith said, but also to what Michael Jordan didn't say. Yvette Prieto was still nowhere to be seen. It had been almost a week since she had last been seen. The press team and personal stylists, who used to accompany him to every event, and even his social media accounts, had all fallen silent. It was as if someone had pressed a button and made him invisible. And this silence was no longer a strategic move. but was beginning to turn into suspicion. Rumors spread quickly in NBA circles. Why was Yvette silent? Why wouldn't Jordan let her speak? And the real question, had Yvette really turned her back on Jordan? Reports began to surface in the press that there had been a rift between the two for some time, that they had been seen alone at certain events. But this time, it wasn't just rumors, because they had a document to prove it. And that document was now on everyone's lips. At Jordan Enterprises headquarters, emergency meetings were in full swing. The legal team, financial advisors, and media strategists. Almost everyone was looking for an answer. Who gave him these documents? That's when a name came up. Reggie Langston, Jordan's former advisor. He had quietly left his job years ago and had never appeared in front of the cameras again. But in recent weeks, he had allegedly been spotted in Palm Beach. And according to another claim, he had also happened to be at the same notary office as Yvette Prieto's lawyer. There was no concrete evidence, but the suspicions were strong. Some members of Jordan's team had even begun whispering his name behind the scenes. But before this information leaked to the public, a note was slipped under the door of Stephen A.'s office. The sender was, of course, unknown. It contained only a few words. "Reggie is clean, but you're not that far off." Tasha read the note twice. Then she went to the door and checked the hallway. No one was there. "Do you believe this message?" she asked. Stephen A. held the paper in his hand for a moment. "Someone is clearly scared," he said, "and people only get scared when the time is near." At the same time, Michael Jordan was walking alone in the hallway of his private office in Chicago. He had his phone in his hand. He was calmer now, though still a little nervous. This time his voice was lower, but he wasn't angry, just tired. "It's definitely one of us," he said to the person on the phone. It would never have come out any other way. That evening, the NBA press was in a frenzy. New allegations, old footage, and expert commentary. In a video from a year ago, Yvette was asked, "Ms. Yvette, will you rejoin the campaign?" "We'll see," she replied, and her answer was back in the spotlight. At the time, no one had paid much attention to it, but now, every word seemed like it was part of a script written in advance. Stephen A. remained silent. He hadn't made a single public statement. He hadn't appeared on any television programs. He just sat in his office, his eyes glued to the documents, his mind far away. Legal advisor Cynthia Maxwell muttered to herself as she examined the envelopes. "It's all on record, court approved, all public documents." Stephen A. looked up. "You know they're going to accuse me of forgery." Cynthia shrugged. "Let them accuse you. The truth never needs to change its clothes." But this truth had already seeped into the veins of not only the Jordan family, but the entire NBA. Because this was no longer just about a prenuptial agreement. It was about trust, visibility, and power dynamics. Essentially, it was about the need to speak out about things that no one dared to talk about. The Jordan side did not release any videos to the public during this process. No statement was made. Only a short text was released. Yvette Prieto continues to support her husband Michael Jordan and the NBA family. But this statement did not silence the cameras or the debate. On the contrary, it raised even more questions. Why aren't we hearing from him? Why is Jordan staying silent? The crisis management team was in a state of panic. Some sponsors also expressed their concerns. A few major investors even requested that meetings be postponed, because people no longer felt the need to question only Jordan, but also the walls around him. And worst of all, this story was no longer political, but had become personal. People were discussing not only the events themselves, but also the feelings they evoked. An NBA fan told a local news outlet, "You don't renegotiate a marriage contract, unless, of course, you don't know what the future holds." Stephen A.'s silence had become almost rival to Jordan's. But there is a difference between them, of course. Stephen A.'s silence was strategic. Jordan's was fragile. And this difference did not escape the public eye. People were now more focused on why they were silent than on who was not speaking. The real voice behind the silence grew louder, and the story had long since become a matter that concerned not only Michael Jordan's family, but the very soul of the NBA. One morning, A small women's shelter in Sacramento launched a fundraising campaign on social media. The campaign image featured Stephen A. Smith's famous quote, "The truth never asks for permission." On the same day, a new mural painted on a wall in Kansas City went viral on social media. Stephen A.'s face was on the wall, and underneath it read, "You don't have to say everything, but you can't silence the truth." This was not the success of a journalist. It wasn't the coming out of a media figure. It was a crack that people had been feeling for years but could never put a name to. And now, that crack had become a visible chasm. The Jordan camp continued to develop new strategies to counter this growing wave. Press advisors had issued statements to some television channels under the headline, "Abuse of Freedom of Expression." However, these statements received no attention because the public was no longer interested in what Stephen A. had said. Instead, they were interested in why Jordan had still not said anything. A journalist obtained video footage of Michael Jordan from a leaked old sponsorship meeting. In the video, Jordan said, "Involving my family in media games is not my thing." But now the media game had entered his home, and this time, silence was not protecting him. On the contrary, it was casting an even darker shadow over the allegations. At that time, some former NBA players had already started speaking out. A retired all-star said the following on a podcast he appeared on. "This isn't just about Jordan. It's a culture of silence that this system has perpetuated for years. Stephen A. is targeting that culture." Yvette Prieto was still nowhere to be seen, but her absence from the spotlight didn't mean she was out of the story. On the contrary, her absence from Jordan's side had already caused quite a stir. Some news sites had even begun to claim that she had moved on. One of her former stylists shared the following statement on social media. "She was very quiet during our last meeting, but she seemed to have made up her mind to leave." And then the bombshell hit the country like a missile. A Florida-based local newspaper published a 4-paragraph article that would have an impact lasting for hours. Correspondence between Yvette Prieto's law firm and Jordan revealed that she had instructed them to restructure the prenuptial agreement. This email was sent just 3.5 months before Jordan launched his 2024 NBA endorsement campaign. The email read as follows: "Financial independence is requested to protect against potential future public reputation risks." This sentence was repeated on screens for minutes on end. Everyone from program hosts to lawyers to even former players talked about this one sentence. Because this was no longer an allegation. It was a document. It was a date, and it was a choice. When the news broke in Stephen A.'s office, Tasha rushed in with a printout in her hand. "This is the truth," she said. "They can't hide it anymore." Stephen A. Smith stared at the document for a long time. There was no smile of victory on his face, nor any anger. He just muttered, "Now they definitely have to respond." But Michael Jordan's camp took a different approach. That day, the spokesperson for Jordan Enterprises took the podium. It was a crowded press room. Everyone was wondering if Yvette would speak. But the person who stepped up to the microphone said, "We will not comment on private family matters. Yvette Prieto is focused solely on her family and her projects." At that moment, everyone understood. This was not a denial. It was an evasion, and this evasion made Jordan even more isolated in the public eye. It was as if they were watching a legend who had won countless games on the court being defeated in real life. And this time, the defeat did not come from a rival. It came from a wall of silence he had built himself. A day later, speaking at a charity event in Indiana, Jordan made no mention of the incident. But when he finished his speech, as he put down the microphone and adjusted his jacket, his expression was caught on camera. That expression seemed to say that he was just as lonely as ever. Stephen A. Smith made no comment. He simply posted a single sentence on his social media accounts. "When power hides behind silence, truth speaks louder." The post was reposted 250,000 times within an hour. This was no longer just a story. This was a moment of transformation. And it wasn't just the NBA that was changing, but people's view of reality. Every word Stephen A. Smith said was no longer just a comment. He was speaking even when he wasn't in front of the cameras, because even his silence was a statement. He didn't even need to speak loudly. The truth had already taken his place. A law school in Philadelphia organized a panel on high-profile prenuptial agreements. The panel's name consisted of a single sentence: "If a contract is silent, what is it protecting?" On the same day, the following words were written in large letters on a university campus wall in Chicago: "Speaking the truth is not an attack." Stephen A. was no longer just a sports commentator. He had become the unstoppable voice of media power in NBA history, and that voice had shaken an empire. Michael Jordan, meanwhile, was becoming more and more isolated with each passing day. Campaign events were not being canceled, but they were becoming less frequent. Some sponsor meetings were shelved with the note, "rescheduled." According to inside information, some major donors had even begun to withdraw their contributions. Others had quietly turned their attention to other areas. Because Jordan was no longer just a legend, he had become a symbol of the price of silence. Yvette Prieto had not been seen in public for almost 2 weeks. But then, something unexpected happened. One Sunday, she arrived alone at a children's hospital in Orlando. She had no press secretary or private security with her. She was holding a plain white folder. Her outfit was not very striking. Her demeanor was calm, measured, and very controlled. Of course, the press had been kept away that day, so there were no questions. But the real news was not the hospital visit, of course. Just an hour after the visit, a short 2-paragraph statement was published on the official website of Jordan Enterprises, which operates like the White House. "As a wife, mother, and individual, I do not believe it is appropriate for my family and private life to be scrutinized by the public. Silence is sometimes the clearest form of defense. Those who use my family reveal themselves, but I never will." These words led to different interpretations in the media. Some interpreted it as an elegant stance. Others saw it as a sign of a silent farewell. But everyone agreed this was not a defense. It was a declaration of withdrawal. When Michael Jordan saw the statement at his private golf club in Florida, he couldn't hide his anger. According to a consultant, after he had everyone in the room leave, he said, "It makes me look weak. Even his silence leaves me alone." That night, word spread that 2 major sponsorship deals had been suspended. Another announced that it would direct its contributions to regional organizations only. The Jordan camp was once again in a state of panic. Attempts were made to put pressure on the press, but it was too late. Once the truth was out, no one could remain the same. Stephen A. Smith was home alone that night. His phone was off. The lights were dim and the TV was on, but there was no sound. When Tasha knocked on his door with a bag of food, he didn't even answer. The door was open. When she entered, she found Stephen A. sitting silently on the couch. "We can slow down now," Tasha said softly. "You make a statement. Everyone will calm down a little." Stephen A. shook his head. "They want us to calm down because they're afraid. But I'm not tired. I'm just angry." And the next morning, he appeared in front of cameras for the first time in weeks. But it wasn't on a major national network. It was a modest, mid-morning show. There were no colorful graphics. There was no background music. Just a microphone, a camera, and the truth. The host got straight to the point. Was this incident personal or political? Stephen A. didn't hesitate. The truth is uncomfortable, but this wasn't personal. It was systemic. If the truth isn't spoken, people remain silent. The second question came immediately after. "Do you feel any regret for revealing such a private detail in a public meeting?" Stephen A. took a deep breath. Of course not, because no one else had the courage to say it. That sentence was shared millions of times on the internet in a matter of minutes, because people no longer saw only Jordan in this story, but themselves as well. That marriage contract represented something else for many. Who is expected to remain silent? And why? After that day, Stephen A. received dozens of invitations. Conferences, panels, student clubs, civil society meetings. But he hadn't even gone to most of them, because this was no longer a victory. It was a warning. One evening, as he was reading a letter that had arrived at his home, Tasha quietly approached him. Inside the envelope was a letter that simply read, "Someone had to do this. You are not alone, my friend." There was no signature, but Stephen A. held the letter to his chest. and he whispered only, "Finally, they know." And they really did know. Because this story did not happen to cast a shadow on Michael Jordan's legend. It was brought to light to show how much silence, which no one questioned, could cover up. Stephen A. Smith didn't get angry. He didn't insult anyone. He just showed a document. And then it happened. Because sometimes a single match is enough, and a country burns with its fire. Some felt the burn instead of the warmth for the first time. If this story made you think, don't keep it to yourself. Share, talk, discuss, and follow me to uncover more truths together.